the story of the day yesterday was this Twitter battle between our fearless leader at OutKick, Clay Travis, and one Mark Cuban. This is not the first time these guys have gotten into it over the years. They love to go at each other. Mark Cuban sometimes will fire a shot at Clay over something he says on one of his shows, over something he writes, and Clay will respond in kind on Twitter. Now, this one was in response to a piece that Clay wrote at OutKick about the demise of the NBA. And I want to pull up this tweet from Clay. First off, if you have not read it, I advise it. It's really, really well done by Clay. I thought it laid out a lot of facts very well and really talks about the last 25 years in the NBA and how NBA Finals ratings have really suffered. Here's the tweet from Clay I want to read because I think this sums up his piece really well. Since peaking in 1998 with Michael Jordan, the NBA Finals have lost 80% of their audience in the present LeBron era. No other pro sports league is close to this audience collapse. Many, like the NFL, college football, and college basketball, have actually grown over that time. That from Clay Travis. And I think that's a pretty good summary of what his argument was in his piece at OutKick.com. Again, read it if you haven't. It's longer than that. There's a lot more information in it, a lot more opinion. Clay does a good job with it, and he lays out his argument really well. One thing that stuck out to me in his argument was in the heyday of the NBA, when the ratings were at their best, in the buildup of Larry versus Magic going into the 90s and Michael Jordan and his dominance with the Bulls, we didn't know about the politics of the stars in the league because it was all about the basketball. It was all about the competition. It was all about greatness. And Michael Jordan, Clay's written a book stealing a quote from Michael Jordan that says, Republicans buy sneakers too, as to why he wouldn't endorse a Democratic political candidate back in the early 90s. So I agree with all that. The NBA was in part better than for all of those reasons. Now, Clay lays out a lot of the reasons why the NBA has fallen apart, and a lot of it is because of a left-leaning political agenda bordering on extremism at times, with players deciding not to play playoff games because of a police shooting that they didn't have all their facts on when deciding to boycott it. Let's just put it that way. Reading headlines, not reading a full story, not knowing a full story, and then emotionally reacting to it and speaking out against it. And that has caused backlash from a lot of NBA fans. I agree with everything Clay says. Now, Mark Cuban takes offense to this. So Mark Cuban comes at Clay. Clay calls him to the mat for this Twitter fight. Mark Cuban responds. They go at it for a while. They're going back and forth. Eventually, Clay ends up calling Mark Cuban the B word. And then Mark Cuban says, you wouldn't tell your son to talk to someone like that, so I've won the argument. He declares victory. Clay goes into his corner, calls him a couple other cuss words, goes at him again. Clay declares victory. Clay's people declare victory, and so on and so forth. And as I like to say, the world continues to turn on the axis of division. Now, you're going to have everyone that's on the left, all of the NBA supporters in the media, NBA players, Dallas Mavericks brass, people that know Mark Cuban and defend him, people that defend the league's politics at all times. They're all going to line up, and they're going to stand behind their boy, Mark Cuban, and say, boom, you got him. You pissed off the great Clay Travis, and you won the argument. Then you're going to have everyone over here on the right that's going to line up and say, you owned him. You destroyed that lib, Clay. Great job. You showed him who his daddy was. Good job, Clay, on that. All very, very predictable. You don't come to this show for predictable. At least I hope not. And I don't want to condition our audience to come to this show for predictable. So let me give you my 100% authentic opinion on what really happened in this Twitter feud. And that is that I think Clay won, but barely. And quite frankly, knowing Clay Travis as well as I do, I am shocked this debate was this close because Clay had facts in his corner. And Mark Cuban spewed a lot of stuff that didn't make a lot of sense from a fact standpoint. But when defending woke stances, Mark Cuban, with a brilliant move, decided to go to the Fox employee handbook and copy and paste some things about diversity and inclusion. And Clay sold his company to Fox. Hey, Bravo. Clay's response to that was to get mad and go back at him saying, I run OutKick. Well, Clay hired me at OutKick. Clay doesn't sign my check, so I don't know that that's necessarily true. He makes a lot of the decisions, but this is a Fox-owned company. So I don't say that to say anything bad about Fox. I say that because every corporation has diversity and inclusion included in everything they do. This is no surprise. What Mark Cuban is laying out doesn't shock anyone who works for anyone. Of course you do. You don't want to get sued. You don't want to be seen as someone who has a bias, prejudice, that you're bigoted. All of those things. All of those things are true. But he put Clay into a corner, and Clay, again, with his piece and what he said, had facts on his side, and he fought his case well. I'm the only one at OutKick who probably will say this, simply because I've known Clay the longest, and I'm a very, very close friend of his. And Clay and I hosted our first ever radio show. Well, his first radio show, not mine, together back in 2007. So I can say this. Clay would never call Mark Cuban what he called him on Twitter to his face. That's not who Clay is. And let me say that is a compliment to my friend Clay Travis. Because Clay is not someone who reacts emotionally. Clay reacts with intelligence. He reacts with logic. He will argue a point to the death. But he's not an emotional guy. He's not someone to do that. So when I see Clay calling him names on Twitter, part of me thinks, this is Clay being a really good salesman. And let me tell you, Clay's a hell of a salesman. Clay, you don't go from writing for an obscure website to building your own media empire and selling it for a ton of money to a major corporate media conglomerate by not being a good salesman and not knowing what you're doing. But if Clay was in an argument face-to-face with Mark Cuban, he's not saying that to him. So part of that is a bit of an online persona, which works very well. So I would highly advise you go back and read the back and forth between the two. But Fort, I'm here to tell you that as someone who knows Clay well and knows how smart he is and how good he is at arguing a point, I am shocked that it had to go to a decision and that it was not a KO. I thought Clay would end him on Twitter. He did not. Cuban fought well. But if it's going to the referee's decision, and I'll be the referee in this one, I give Clay the points, barely, at the end of a full bout of all the rounds being fought. What did you make of the back and forth between the two?
Mark Cuban is so predictable, in my opinion. Every argument he's in, he always kind of circles back to the talking points, the agenda that comes from that big corporation, that big thought process. And that, at the end of the day, is what the NBA team owners are. They're just a giant corporation. They're trying to grow their business, whether it's left, whether it's right, but they should find common ground. And if they really wanted that common ground, they would sit face to face, right? Mark Cuban would say, all right, let's talk. Let's get together. Let's have a conversation. I'll come on OutKicks. You come on my, whatever he does, whatever, maybe it's CNN, maybe it's Fox. It doesn't matter. Just find a neutral
Shark
ground,
Tank.
have a conversation. The reality of it is it would never happen, Chad. It would never happen because these guys don't want to go face to face with a guy like Clay Travis because they know that he's going to make them emotional when they show up. And that's the problem. He's going to get emotional. I've seen Mark Cuban get emotional time and time again on Twitter, just like Clay did. And I think he was trying to spark something because he is a salesman. I don't know him as well as you did, but everything I've ever heard about that man is very genuine. I mean, I'm from Knoxville. He's always in Knoxville, went to UT. He's a guy that a lot of people say a lot of great things about, whether they have a left stance, right stance. Once they meet this guy, they have a different opinion of him. It's easy to take that road and say, oh yeah, because of his beliefs, I don't believe that. But genuinely having a conversation with somebody is very important. These guys won't do it. I mean, we've seen it over and over again. They will not get in front of a camera and have a genuine debate with anybody with any intelligence because they know they're not comfortable with their beliefs. They don't necessarily know if the facts are going to line up because they have a bunch of yes men around them.
Well,
that's
and look,
these guys do, right?
Yeah, yeah. And Clay, you know, the big point he's hammered home with anyone in the NBA is, will you denounce the human rights violations in China?
Right.
Which is a great point to hammer home over and over. And they're never going to do it. Mark Cuban's not going to do it. And it is sad, but let me also say, a lot of money makes all of us hypocrites. Right. I mean, that's what it is. When you're playing at that level of money, Clay included, it's going to turn you into a hypocrite at some point. So Mark Cuban, I think, in one tweet says, I denounce human rights violations everywhere, but wouldn't say specifically in China. Well, why is that? Because the NBA doesn't need the United States to be successful. They're making enough in China specifically. It's a business decision by him. Now, where Clay, I think, ultimately wins the argument, getting back into the weeds of the argument, and the point that he made, which is a good one, you can't stand on social justice issues and treat the United States of America like it's some backwards country where there's a totalitarian regime that's invoking fear and violence in it with everyone at all times, and then turn around and not say that China's got a lot of problems and not mention their country by name. That's where Mark Cuban's the ultimate hypocrite. That's where everyone in the NBA will always be a hypocrite because they're never going to admit it. Why? Because they make a lot of money. They make a lot of money from China. And that's really the bottom line here, Michael, unfortunately, is the bottom line and not necessarily what's right.
You're exactly right. And money brings out who you really are, right? It just brings out that in maybe an expedited fashion, or just brings out that bigger light of who you are. And that's exactly what's happening. You're right. These guys are not going to speak on something that's bringing in millions and billions of dollars, because they know if they do, they may pull back and they lose that money. They lose that income that they so desperately probably don't even need. But the reality of it is they're just not going to push back. And that's sad. I mean, you have to have a stance some way, shape, or form. You have to have standards. You have to have values, because at the end of the day, that's all that matters. How are you remembered by what you stood for? These guys really don't stand for anything. It seems like they float around. You cannot say that about Clay. He stands on what he believes day in, day out. He'll go out and speak on it day in, day out. That's why I love you guys. And I respectfully love people from both sides, especially if they'll just stand on what they believe, because we don't know their reality, their perceived reality, or what's going on. Could be money issue, could be work issue, could be something that we don't even know. The reality of it is you have to jump out in front of it. Back and just wait and say, okay, I'm going to take a left. I'm going to take a right. I'm going to do this. No, just be who you are. Stand on your values, the same values you're teaching your kids. Maybe that's what you should stand on.
Yeah, and I'm right there with you on that. And I think that we can all respect each other on opposite sides, even at times, even if it feels like we can't. And I'm just surprised because I've seen Clay. He's got like a 999 batting average on social media when he battles people. I don't know that he's ever truly lost a Twitter battle. That was one of the closest ones I've ever seen him come to lose. That part of it surprised me. And that's a compliment to Clay that he's got such a high batting average, because when he goes after someone, he typically has intelligence and facts on his side, and he wins those battles. And again, he won the one yesterday. I'm not saying that he lost, but it got a little closer than I thought, because I think some things kind of hit close to home and got him emotional. But either way, we can all have a conversation and eventually figure out both sides. I've always said this about Bernie Sanders. I disagree with Bernie Sanders on almost everything politically, quite frankly. But I respect the heck out of the guy. Why? Because I think he's a true believer in everything he says. I 100% believe him that he believes those things. I don't think he's playing to any one side about money or anything. I think he believes everything he says. And you're right, Fort. There's something to be said for belief and believing what you say. I'm with you on that.
Yeah, if someone's passionate about what they believe, it may be all they know. I have a great story about a guy that was an atheist that we became really close. He found faith later on, but that's all he knew. He grew up around his dad, who was an atheist, did not believe, because he was burdened by the church. He was pushed and prodded constantly in his life by people of faith. So he put a face, not Jesus, he put a face on those people and said, this is what God is. That's not true at all. So he became an atheist, but just by treating that guy with respect and letting him just pour out what he believed, just with the ability of saying, hey, I have empathy for whatever you're going to tell me. I'm just going to sit here and listen, because I'm going to learn something, because I want to understand how you got to this belief, and I want you to understand how I got to mine. If he never asked me, I wouldn't have said a word. I would just sat there and listened. That's what we should do more often.